Hiroshima was not bombed to save lives. It was not bombed to end the war. Hiroshima was bombed because it was the perfect laboratory. In August 1945, the United States carried out the largest human experiment in history. The people of Hiroshima were not simply casualties of war. They were test subjects. Every burn, every shadow scorched into stone, every body that crumbled from radiation was data. Hiroshima was not chosen for its military importance. It was chosen for its scientific value. The bomb was not an act of desperation, but an experiment dressed up as necessity. From the moment the Manhattan Project scientists realized their creation worked, the question was no longer if the bomb would be used, but how it could be tested on a living city. Laboratories in New Mexico could only tell them so much. The true effects of nuclear weapons on human bodies, on urban environments, on the psychology of a population could never be replicated in a desert. For that, they needed a city, and that city was Hiroshima. The official story says America dropped the atomic bomb to force Japan's surrender, to save countless lives that would be lost in an invasion. But this is a story designed to comfort. The truth is darker. By the summer of 1945, Japan was already collapsing. Its cities were in ruins, its navy destroyed, its people starving. Its leaders were sending peace feelers through neutral countries, hoping to negotiate terms. And on August 8th, just 2 days after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union invaded, ensuring Japan had no chance of continuing the war. The war was over. The bomb was unnecessary. Unless, of course, ending the war was not the real purpose. The real purpose was testing. And for that purpose, Hiroshima was ideal. Chapter 1. The selection of a test site. By early 1945, American bombers had reduced much of Japan to ash. Firebombing raids killed hundreds of thousands, leveling Tokyo and dozens of other cities. But not Hiroshima. Hiroshima was left alone, not because it was unimportant, but because it was perfect. Hiroshima had a population of about 350,000, large enough to measure mass destruction, small enough to contain it. It had not been heavily bombed, meaning the effects of the atomic blast could be measured without interference from previous damage. Its flat geography and rivers would amplify the shockwave and the firestorm. It was, as one American targeting report said, a virgin city. This was not coincidence. U.S. officials deliberately avoided bombing Hiroshima with conventional weapons. Why waste the experiment? When the targeting committee met in May and June of 1945, they reviewed potential sites, not as military targets, but as test subjects. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was considered but rejected for political reasons. Hiroshima remained at the top of the list. It had military headquarters, yes, but its real value was as a pristine testing ground. The scientists and generals discussed Hiroshima not as a city of people, but as an object of study. They wanted to know, how far would the blast radius extend? How would reinforced concrete buildings react? What percentage of the population would survive? How quickly would fire spread? These were research questions. Hiroshima was the answer. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was dropped. In less than a second, the center of the city was vaporized. Temperatures reached several thousand degrees Celsius. People were turned to ash where they stood. Shadows of human beings were burned into stone steps. And as tens of thousands died instantly, scientists in America were already preparing to study the results. Hiroshima was not spared by accident. It was preserved for this moment. A city carefully chosen, its people unknowingly waiting to become part of an experiment. Chapter 2. The Scientific Experiment. The bomb was not dropped in secrecy and forgotten. Quite the opposite. From the very moment Hiroshima was destroyed, teams of American scientists and military officials were preparing to study the effects. They were not doctors rushing to provide aid. They were researchers eager to collect data. The Manhattan Project had already produced endless calculations about blast effects, radiation, and firestorms. But calculations were not enough. The scientists wanted proof. They wanted real numbers on real human bodies. How far from the blast would third-degree burns appear? How quickly would radiation sickness set in? How many structures would collapse at given distances? Hiroshima was the only place to find out. Within weeks, American survey teams were on the ground in Japan. These were not relief missions. Survivors later remembered how quickly investigators arrived with cameras, tape, measures, and notebooks. They photographed burns. They charted the spread of disease. They recorded death tolls in exact detail. One survivor put it bluntly, "We were not treated as human beings. We were specimens." The urgency of this research reveals the truth. If the bomb had been used solely to force surrender, then once the surrender was achieved, the story would be over. But instead, the focus shifted instantly to measurement. The experiment was not complete until the data had been collected. Hiroshima was not just a bombing. It was a controlled study. Chapter 3. The second test. 3 days after Hiroshima, before Japan could even process what had happened, before its government could surrender, the second bomb fell. This was Nagasaki. On August 9th, 1945, at 11:02 a.m., a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man detonated over the city. The official explanation is that Japan had refused to surrender after Hiroshima. But this ignores reality. No government on Earth could respond in 2 days to a catastrophe of such magnitude, with destroyed communications and chaos everywhere. Japan had not yet even understood what had hit Hiroshima when Nagasaki was attacked. So why rush? Why strike again so soon? Because Nagasaki was not about surrender. Nagasaki was about comparison. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was uranium-based. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki was plutonium-based. 2 different designs, 2 different technologies. Both needed to be tested, and both were tested on 2 different cities, 2 different populations, in 2 separate live-fire experiments. Chapter 4. The data collection. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed, the United States established what became known as the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. Its mission was not to provide aid, but to study. Teams of doctors and scientists descended upon the ruins to observe survivors, to catalog injuries, and to measure the effects of radiation. This was not humanitarian work. It was research. Survivors were interviewed like participants in an experiment. They were asked where they had been standing, what they had seen, how quickly they developed symptoms. Their burns were photographed. Their bodies were measured. Blood samples were taken. Even the dead were not spared. Corpses were dissected to study radiation damage. For the commission, every victim was a data point. The suffering of Hiroshima became an archive of information for the United States' nuclear future. The disturbing truth is that aid was often secondary to research. Doctors were told to observe, not intervene. Many survivors recalled being examined, but not treated. The goal was not to heal them, but to learn from them. And in this way, the experiment continued, long after the bombs had fallen. Chapter 5. The survivors as test subjects. For decades after 1945, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, were studied. They lived with cancers, birth defects, genetic damage, and chronic illness. Instead of being seen first as victims, they were treated as subjects of a long-term study. Their suffering became the baseline for understanding radiation's effects on humans. And yet, their testimony about how and why the bombs were dropped was often ignored. Their voices were silenced, while their bodies remained under the microscope. Many Hibakusha spoke bitterly of being treated as guinea pigs. They understood that the attention paid to their conditions was less about compassion and more about extracting knowledge. The atomic age needed data, and the people of Hiroshima provided it. Every scar, every tumor, every stillborn child was another line in America's research archives. This was not accidental. This was design. Hiroshima was a controlled detonation, and the survivors were living test material. The bomb had transformed an entire city into a laboratory, and the survivors spent the rest of their lives inside it. Chapter 6: The Legacy of the Experiment. The data collected from Hiroshima and Nagasaki was invaluable to the United States military. It shaped nuclear policy throughout the Cold War. The effects on human health, the scale of destruction, the psychological impact on survivors. These findings were used to refine nuclear strategy, to design more powerful weapons, and to prepare for potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union. In other words, the suffering of Hiroshima did not end in 1945. It became the foundation for decades of nuclear planning. Hiroshima was not a tragic accident of war. It was a deliberate demonstration, a scientific trial on a living city, and the results of that trial continue to shape our world today. Every modern nuclear weapon carries within it the data collected from those August days in 1945. The human experiment never truly ended. Chapter 7: Conclusion. The official narrative insists the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to end the war and save lives. But the evidence tells another story. Japan was already defeated. The Soviet invasion sealed its fate. The bombs were not a military necessity. They were experiments. Hiroshima was spared conventional bombing so that the effects of the atomic bomb could be studied on a pristine city. Two different bomb designs were used, only days apart, to compare results. Scientific teams rushed in not to heal but to measure. Survivors lived the rest of their lives as test subjects there, pain fueling America's nuclear arsenal. Hiroshima was not about peace. Hiroshima was about science. Science without morality, science without restraint, science that treated human lives as expendable in the pursuit of knowledge and power. The city became a laboratory. Its people became specimens, and the world was dragged into the nuclear age through the most brutal experiment ever conducted. That is the truth history does not want to admit. Hiroshima was a human experiment.